One strike of a heavy oak gavel was meant to completely destroy an innocent man's life. Trapped before a ruthlessly prejudiced judge, his fate seemed permanently sealed inside a rigged courtroom. Yet, in mere moments, an unexpected, explosive twist would shatter her corrupt empire and deliver absolute, earth-shattering karma. Sunlight struggled to pierce the high, frosted windows of the county courthouse, casting long, fractured shadows across the polished mahogany of the defense table. DeAndre Hayes sat rigid, his hands clasped so tightly in his lap that his knuckles strained white against his dark skin. At 24, DeAndre had spent his life building a meticulous record of excellence. He was a mechanical engineering graduate, a youth mentor, and the sole provider for his younger sister, Chloe. Yet, in the eyes of the woman glaring down at him from the elevated bench, he was nothing more than a statistic waiting to be filed away. Honorable Cynthia Sterling possessed a reputation that preceded her throughout the state. Cold, calculated, and fiercely uncompromising, she was a judge who prided herself on a draconian interpretation of the law, an interpretation that inexplicably fell with crushing weight upon defendants of color. Her courtroom was widely known among public defenders as the slaughterhouse. Sterling had built her 30-year career on a foundation of tough-on-crime rhetoric, leveraging her high conviction rates into political capital. Beneath the veneer of judicial impartiality, however, lay a deep-seated rotting prejudice that infected every ruling, every sustained objection, and every sentence she handed down. Today, DeAndre was the target in her crosshairs. The charges against him were as severe as they were fabricated: aggravated assault and resisting arrest. The reality of the incident, which occurred 3 nights prior, was vastly different. DeAndre had been walking his 19-year-old sister home from her late-shift waitress job when a group of intoxicated, affluent college students began harassing her. When one of them, a young man named Harrison Caldwell, the son of a prominent real estate developer, lunged at Chloe, DeAndre had stepped between them, pushing Harrison back. Harrison, stumbling in his drunken state, tripped over the curb and fractured his wrist. When the police arrived, summoned by Harrison's friends, they didn't take statements from the terrified Chloe or the nearby street vendor who witnessed the entire altercation. They saw a wealthy white student clutching his arm, and they saw a young black man standing over him. The handcuffs were on DeAndre before he could even utter a syllable of defense. "Mr. Belmont, are we ready to proceed, or are we going to waste the taxpayers' morning?" Judge Sterling's voice was like grinding glass. She adjusted her silver-rimmed reading glasses, her pale blue eyes fixed with undisguised contempt on the defense table. Richard Belmont, the assistant district attorney, stood up, smoothing the lapels of his expensive tailored suit. He was a man who knew exactly how to play to Sterling's biases. "The state is ready, Your Honor. We are prepared to demonstrate that the defendant, unprovoked and with malicious intent, viciously attacked Mr. Caldwell, causing severe bodily harm before violently resisting the officers who arrived to restore order." "Objection, Your Honor," interjected Lisa Carmichael, DeAndre's public defender. Lisa was exhausted, carrying a caseload that would break a dozen lawyers, but she possessed a fierce, unrelenting dedication to her clients. "The state is characterizing the events with inflammatory language before a single piece of evidence has been admitted." Judge Sterling didn't even look at Lisa. She waved a dismissive hand, the loose sleeve of her black robe fluttering like a crow's wing. "Overruled. Miss Carmichael, sit down. If your client didn't want his actions characterized as vicious, he shouldn't have engaged in street thuggery. Let's not pretend we don't know exactly what happened here." A collective gasp, soft but palpable, rippled through the gallery behind DeAndre. His mother, sitting in the second row next to a trembling Chloe, let out a stifled sob. DeAndre closed his eyes, his jaw muscles feathering as he swallowed the bitter taste of helplessness. The judge had just pronounced him guilty before the opening statements had even concluded. "Your Honor, with all due respect, my client has no criminal record. He is an engineering graduate and was defending his sister from an aggressive assault," Lisa argued, her voice rising in a desperate attempt to cut through the suffocating bias of the room. "Counselor, I warned you to sit down," Sterling snapped, leaning forward over the bench, her face flushing with sudden, intense anger. I will not have my courtroom turned into a theater for your bleeding heart excuses. I have read the police report. I know the type of environment this behavior stems from. You can dress a defendant up in a borrowed suit, Miss Carmichael, but you cannot dress up their character. Now, are you going to allow the prosecution to proceed, or will I be holding you in contempt? Lisa slowly sank back into her chair, her face pale with suppressed rage. She placed a reassuring hand on DeAndre's arm, but he couldn't feel it. The air in the room felt thick, toxic, and entirely designed to suffocate him. The trial hadn't just begun. It was already over. Sterling was not merely presiding over the case. She was actively engineering his demise, weaponizing her authority to strip him of his dignity, piece by piece, in front of his family and the world. For the next 2 hours, the trial proceeded not as a pursuit of justice, but as a public execution of DeAndre's character. Prosecutor Belmont called his witnesses first, the arresting officers, who delivered a synchronized, heavily rehearsed narrative that painted DeAndre as hostile and wildly aggressive. They conveniently omitted the fact that DeAndre had been calmly asking for them to look at the security cameras mounted on the diner across the street. When Lisa Carmichael attempted to cross-examine the officers about those cameras, Judge Sterling aggressively intervened. "Relevance, Miss Carmichael?" Sterling demanded sharply. "Your Honor, the diner's security cameras directly captured the incident. The officers failed to secure that footage. It proves my client acted purely in self-defense," Lisa stated, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. "The officer's testimony is sufficient for this court," Sterling retorted, her lip curling into a sneer. "We are not going to engage in fishing expeditions just because your client refuses to take accountability for his violent outbursts. Move on, or I will end your cross-examination." But the true horror began when Harrison Caldwell took the stand. Young, arrogant, and sporting a dramatically oversized cast on his arm, Harrison wove a tale of unprovoked terror. He claimed he had simply been walking down the street, minding his own business, when DeAndre approached him demanding money, and upon being refused, brutally shoved him into the pavement. "It was terrifying," Harrison lied, looking directly at the jury box, which, DeAndre noted with a sinking heart, had been meticulously selected to exclude anyone who looked like him. He was out of control, like an animal. "Objection!" Lisa shouted, shooting to her feet. "The witness is using racially coded, inflammatory language." "Sit down, Miss Carmichael," Sterling roared, slamming her gavel so hard the wood echoed like a gunshot. "The witness is describing his trauma. I will not have you police his feelings just because the reality is uncomfortable for your client." Objection overruled. Sterling then turned her attention directly to DeAndre, violating the fundamental protocol of addressing the defense counsel. She leaned over the heavy oak of the bench, her eyes narrowing into slits of pure, unadulterated disdain. "Look at me when I am speaking, Mr. Hayes," she ordered, her tone dripping with venom. DeAndre slowly lifted his gaze to meet hers, maintaining a quiet, dignified composure that only seemed to infuriate the judge further. "I see young men like you in my courtroom every single day," Sterling spat, her voice projecting clearly through the microphone, echoing off the high ceiling. "You come from broken foundations, harboring this innate entitlement, this belief that the rules of civilized society do not apply to you. You think you can roam the streets, intimidating law-abiding citizens, creating chaos because you lack the discipline to channel your energy into anything productive." "Judge Sterling, my client works at a prestigious tech firm," Lisa began, but Sterling's gavel cut her off violently. "I said be quiet, counsel," Sterling snarled. She turned back to DeAndre, her smile thin and cruel. "You think a piece of paper from a university changes who you are? It doesn't. Your behavior here, the violence you inflicted upon an innocent young man, shows exactly what you are, a menace. And it is my solemn duty to ensure that people like you are removed from the streets so that decent, hard-working citizens can walk safely. You are a profound disappointment to your community, though I can't say I am surprised. It is a cultural failing. A heavy, sickening silence descended upon the courtroom, the blatant racism, entirely unmasked and amplified by the microphone, hung in the air. In the gallery, DeAndre's mother stood up, tears streaming down her face. "My son is a good man," she cried out, her voice breaking with an agony that would shatter any compassionate heart. "He was protecting his sister. Why won't you listen?" Judge Sterling's eyes snapped toward the gallery. "Bailiff, remove that woman from my courtroom immediately. If she resists, arrest her for disturbing the peace." "Mom, no, please, just go outside," DeAndre pleaded, his stoic facade finally cracking as two large deputies aggressively grabbed his mother's arms, hauling the sobbing woman toward the double doors. Chloe chased after them, weeping. DeAndre turned back to the judge, his chest heaving. "You don't have to treat her like that. She's just my mother." "You speak when spoken to, boy," Sterling hissed. Leaning so far forward she was almost standing. "You have no rights in this room other than the ones I grant you. You will sit there, you will be silent, and you will prepare yourself for a very long stay in a state penitentiary. I will ensure that the maximum sentence is applied. You are going to learn what happens when you bring your street behavior into my jurisdiction." Prosecutor Belmont smirked, shuffling his papers. He had won without breaking a sweat. The jury looked uncomfortable, but the judge's commanding authority had effectively poisoned the well. The trial was a formality. DeAndre's life was over, stolen by a woman who viewed him as nothing more than an insect to be crushed beneath her judicial boot. Judge Sterling raised her gavel, preparing to call a recess before moving to closing arguments, a triumphant glint in her pale eyes. She had asserted her dominance. She had humiliated him. She had won. But before the wooden mallet could strike the sounding block, the heavy oak double doors at the back of the courtroom burst open with a resounding crash. The sound was so violent that the bailiffs instinctively reached for their sidearms. The gallery turned as one. Judge Sterling froze, her gavel suspended in midair, her face instantly purpling with outrage at the interruption. "Who dares to interrupt my proceedings?" Sterling roared. "Bailiff, arrest whoever just—" Her voice abruptly died in her throat. Striding down the center aisle was not a disgruntled civilian or a lost tourist. It was a man in a sharp, impeccably tailored navy suit, carrying a silver briefcase. Beside him walked three individuals wearing dark windbreakers with the bright, unmistakable yellow letters across their backs. FBI. But it wasn't the federal agents that caused the blood to drain entirely from Judge Cynthia Sterling's face. It was the man leading them. Arthur Pendleton, the most feared civil rights and judicial oversight attorney in the country, walked with the calm, lethal grace of an apex predator. And trailing just behind him, holding a small digital audio recorder and looking terrified but resolute, was someone Sterling never expected to see again, her former law clerk, Gregory Thomas. The atmosphere in courtroom 302 shifted instantly. The suffocating weight of the judge's prejudice was suddenly pierced by the sharp, electric current of impending devastation. The kangaroo court had just been hijacked, and the hunter was about to become the prey. Footsteps echoed like a countdown clock, ticking towards zero, as Arthur Pendleton bypassed the wooden swinging gate that separated the gallery from the trial floor. He did not ask for permission. Behind him, the three FBI agents fanned out, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts, effectively sealing the exits of courtroom 302. Judge Cynthia Sterling's gavel remained frozen in the air. Her face, previously flushed with arrogant triumph, morphed into a mask of furious indignation. "Mr. Pendleton, this is an active trial." Sterling finally shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain of sudden panic. "You have no jurisdiction here. Bailiffs, remove these men immediately. I will have you disbarred for this stunt, Arthur. I will see you ruined." The two court deputies, who had just moments ago aggressively manhandled DeAndre's mother, took a hesitant step forward. But one of the federal agents, a tall woman with steel-gray eyes, calmly held up a leather wallet, flashing a gold shield bearing the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "Stand down, deputies," the agent commanded, her voice carrying absolute, chilling authority. "Unless you want to be named as co-conspirators in a federal indictment." The deputies instantly froze, stepping back and raising their hands in a gesture of surrender. Arthur Pendleton stopped directly beside Lisa Carmichael, who was staring at the scene in stunned disbelief. He placed his sleek silver briefcase on the defense table and snapped the latches open. "Judge Sterling," Pendleton began, his voice a rich, resonant baritone that commanded the entire room without needing a microphone. "I am here on behalf of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, acting under a sealed warrant issued by the Federal District Court. We are not here to observe your proceedings. We are here to dismantle them." Prosecutor Richard Belmont practically leaped out of his chair, his face slick with sudden sweat. "This is highly irregular. You cannot interrupt a state prosecution, Pendleton. This is a gross overreach of federal—" "Sit down, Richard, before I have Agent Miller add obstruction of justice to your rapidly growing list of felony charges," Pendleton snapped, cutting him off with surgical precision. Belmont's jaw snapped shut, and he sank back into his chair, visibly trembling. Sterling slammed her gavel down, a desperate attempt to reclaim control of her domain. "I am the presiding judge in this courtroom. You will address me with respect, and you will leave, or I will hold you in contempt." "You won't be holding anyone in contempt ever again, Cynthia," Pendleton said, withdrawing a thick stack of documents from his briefcase. He turned slightly so the jury, the gallery, and the court reporter could hear every word. "For the past 18 months, the FBI has been conducting a covert investigation into the judicial practices of this county. An investigation triggered by a courageous whistleblower." Pendleton gestured toward the young man standing near the back doors. Gregory Thomas, Sterling's former law clerk, walked slowly down the aisle. He looked terrified, clutching his digital recorder like a lifeline. But he kept his head held high. Sterling's eyes widened in horror. "Gregory? You little traitor. You signed a non-disclosure agreement. An NDA doesn't cover federal civil rights violations, conspiracy, and racketeering, Judge," Gregory said, his voice shaking but resolute. He stopped beside Pendleton. "I couldn't watch you destroy another innocent life, not after what you did to the others. What lies are you peddling?" Sterling spat, her hands gripping the edge of the bench so tightly her knuckles were stark white. "This is a fabrication, a political witch hunt." Pendleton handed a copy of the federal warrant to a pale, shaking court clerk. "It is no fabrication, Cynthia. We have secured thousands of internal emails, text messages, and off-the-record chamber recordings. We know exactly how you operate. We know about the private dinners with William Caldwell." At the mention of his father's name, Harrison Caldwell, still sitting in the witness box, went completely rigid. The color drained from the young man's face, his arrogant smirk instantly replaced by absolute terror. "William Caldwell," Pendleton continued, turning to address the jury in the stunned courtroom, "is the largest real estate developer in this county, and conveniently, the primary silent financier of Judge Sterling's re-election PAC. 3 nights ago, his son, Harrison, drunkenly assaulted an innocent young woman. When her brother, DeAndre Hayes, defended her, Harrison sustained an injury. To protect his son's pristine record and his own public image, William Caldwell made a phone call." Pendleton turned his piercing gaze back to the bench. "He called you, Judge Sterling, and you in turn called District Attorney Belmont. Together, you orchestrated a fabricated prosecution. You buried exculpatory evidence. You coached the arresting officers to falsify their reports. And you deliberately railroaded a young, brilliant black man, exploiting the very racial prejudices you swore an oath to dismantle, simply to secure your campaign funding." "Objection!" Belmont screamed, his voice breaking into a high pitch. "This is slander." Pendleton didn't even look at him. He simply nodded to Gregory. Gregory pressed a button on his digital recorder and held it up to the courtroom microphone on the defense table. The audio was crystal clear. "I don't care if the diner footage shows the Caldwell boy starting it. Judge Sterling's recorded voice sneered through the speakers, dripping with malice. "Bury the tape, Richard. Lose it in the evidence room. The Hayes kid is a nobody from the East Side. He's black, he's big, and the jury will take one look at him and convict. Put him away for 5 years. Caldwell promised $100,000 to the PAC if his son's name stays out of the papers. Just feed the jury the usual thug narrative. It works every time." "Understood, Cynthia," came Belmont's recorded reply. "I'll prep the officers tonight." Silence, heavier and far more profound than the one that had started the trial, crashed down upon the courtroom. The recording was damning. It was irrefutable. It was the sound of a supposedly blind justice system ripping off its blindfold to reveal rotting, prejudiced eyes. In the jury box, several jurors gasped out loud. One woman covered her mouth in sheer horror. The court reporter's fingers were flying across her steno machine, immortalizing the destruction of Judge Cynthia Sterling's career. Lisa Carmichael stood beside DeAndre, tears springing to her eyes. She gripped his shoulder, squeezing it tight. DeAndre himself sat completely frozen. He had known he was innocent. He had known the system was rigged against him today, but hearing the actual, calculated malice, hearing a judge explicitly weaponize his race to destroy his life for money, sent a shockwave of cold nausea through his chest. Sterling stood paralyzed behind the bench. Her mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish, but no words came out. The absolute power she had wielded just 10 minutes prior had evaporated, leaving behind a pathetic, exposed criminal. "You are a disgrace to the robe," Pendleton said, his voice cold and hard as steel. "You have mocked the Constitution, ruined innocent families, and operated a criminal enterprise from the bench." Suddenly, Prosecutor Belmont scrambled backward, knocking his chair to the floor. "I was coerced!" he shouted, throwing his hands up, instantly turning on his co-conspirator. "She forced me! She threatened to end my career if I didn't comply. I can testify against her, Pendleton. I'll give you everything on Caldwell." "Shut up, Richard!" Sterling finally screamed, her composure entirely shattered. She pointed a trembling finger at him. "You spineless coward. You were more than happy to take the conviction bonuses." "Save it for your federal arraignment," Agent Miller interrupted, stepping forward. At that exact moment, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened once more. Honorable Marcus Vance Waite, Honorable David Thorne Waite, the prompt forbade Vance and Thorne. Honorable Robert Kensington, the Chief Administrative Judge of the State District, walked in, flanked by 2 state troopers. He looked absolutely sickened. Kensington approached the bench, looking up at Sterling with profound disgust. "Cynthia, the state Supreme Court has convened an emergency session based on the DOJ's preliminary findings. You are hereby stripped of your judicial authority, effective immediately. Step down from that bench." "Robert, you can't do this," she pleaded, tears of pure selfishness finally spilling down her cheeks. "It's a setup. It's out of context." "Step down," Kensington barked, his voice echoing like thunder, "before I have the troopers drag you down by your collar." Trembling violently, Cynthia Sterling slowly descended the wooden stairs from her elevated platform. The moment her feet touched the floor of the well, Agent Miller and another FBI agent flanked her. "Cynthia Sterling, you are under arrest for federal racketeering, conspiracy to commit perjury, and multiple violations of the Civil Rights Act," Agent Miller recited, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from her belt. Sterling recoiled. No, you can't put those on me. I'm a judge. I have status. People are watching." "Turn around," Miller ordered coldly. When Sterling hesitated, the second agent forcibly spun her around, yanking her arms behind her back. The harsh click-clack of the ratcheting metal cuffs echoed through the silent courtroom. It was a sound Sterling had ordered hundreds of times, a sound she had reveled in. Now it was the sound of her own absolute destruction. Across the room, another agent had already approached the witness stand. Harrison Caldwell was sobbing openly, clutching his fake cast. "My dad is going to kill me," he whimpered, as an agent pulled him to his feet and cuffed him for felony perjury. Prosecutor Belmont, hyperventilating, was read his rights and placed in irons by the state troopers. Next, Lisa Carmichael didn't waste a single second. She turned to Chief Judge Kensington. Your Honor, in light of this unprecedented revelation of prosecutorial and judicial misconduct, the defense moves for an immediate dismissal of all charges against DeAndre Hayes with extreme prejudice. Kensington nodded, his expression softening as he looked at DeAndre. Motion granted, Counselor. Mr. Hayes, on behalf of the state, I offer you my deepest, most sincere apologies. You have endured a nightmare that never should have happened. The charges against you are dismissed. You are completely free to go. DeAndre exhaled a breath it felt like he had been holding for 3 days. His broad shoulders slumped as the immense, crushing weight of the fabricated prison sentence vanished. He turned to Lisa, wrapping the exhausted public defender in a massive, overwhelming hug. Thank you, DeAndre whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for fighting for me. Always, DeAndre, Lisa replied, wiping a tear from her cheek. Always. As DeAndre turned toward the gallery gate, the double doors burst open one last time. His mother, who had been waiting anxiously in the hallway, rushed into the courtroom, followed closely by Chloe. They bypassed the wooden gate and sprinted across the floor. DeAndre caught them both in his arms, burying his face in his mother's shoulder as she wept tears of overwhelming joy. The nightmare was over. The truth had cut through the darkness. Behind them, the disgraced, handcuffed Cynthia Sterling was being marched down the center aisle, her head bowed in ultimate humiliation. As she passed DeAndre and his family, she risked a glance up. DeAndre looked right back at her. He didn't gloat. He didn't scream. He simply looked at her with the quiet, unyielding dignity of a man who had survived her worst and remained unbroken. Sterling quickly looked away, staring at the floor as the agents led her out of the courtroom, out of her career, and straight into the waiting jaws of a federal penitentiary. News of the dramatic FBI raid within courtroom 302 did not just make the local evening broadcasts, it detonated across national media networks like a seismic charge. By the time DeAndre Hayes walked out of the heavy brass doors of the county courthouse, a free man with his mother and sister clinging tightly to his arms, a sea of microphones and blinding camera flashes was waiting for him. But DeAndre did not stop to give a triumphant speech. He simply guided his family through the chaotic throng, holding his head high, a silent testament to the resilience that Cynthia Sterling had tried so desperately to break. Within 48 hours, the corrupt ecosystem that had sustained Cynthia Sterling for decades completely collapsed. William Caldwell, the billionaire real estate tycoon who believed his wealth could purchase the scales of justice, was arrested at his sprawling countryside estate. Federal agents descended upon his mansion at dawn, dragging the furious pajama-clad developer out in front of the very local news crews he had previously bribed to keep his son's name out of the press. Caldwell was hit with a mountain of federal charges, including bribery of a public official, wire fraud, and violating the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations (RICO) Act. His son, Harrison, having already confessed to perjury in a state of absolute panic, was facing his own lengthy prison sentence. But the true storm was reserved for Cynthia Sterling. Her suspension from the bench was quickly followed by formal disbarment. Stripped of her black robe, her gavel, and the sycophantic respect she had demanded for 30 years, she was reduced to the status of a high-profile federal inmate. Held without bail due to the severity of her crimes and the flight risk her immense hoarded wealth posed, Sterling spent her days in a sterile, concrete holding cell at the Federal Detention Center. She demanded special treatment, organic meals, and a private television. The guards, unimpressed by a disgraced judge, gave her standard-issue bologna sandwiches and absolute silence. 6 months later, the federal trial of the United States versus Cynthia Sterling commenced. The presiding authority was Federal District Judge Wallace Montgomery, a jurist renowned for his brilliant legal mind and absolute zero-tolerance policy for judicial misconduct. Unlike Sterling's dingy, shadow-filled courtroom, Judge Montgomery's federal court was bright, imposing, and humming with the lethal efficiency of true justice. Arthur Pendleton, operating as the special federal prosecutor, built a case so airtight it was suffocating. He didn't just bring the audio recording of Sterling and Belmont, he brought a devastating paper trail. Pendleton's forensic accountants had followed Caldwell's dark money through 3 different shell companies, straight into a luxurious offshore account controlled by Sterling. But the most damaging testimony came from those she had betrayed. Richard Belmont, desperate to avoid a 20-year sentence, took a plea deal and turned state's evidence. Sitting on the witness stand, looking gaunt and defeated, the former prosecutor laid bare the entire operation. She called it cleaning the streets, Belmont testified, his voice echoing in the silent federal courtroom. But it was just a quota system. If Caldwell needed a permit expedited, or if a zoning board member needed a favor, Judge Sterling would arrange it. In return, the PAC money flowed. But to keep her tough-on-crime image secure for elections, she needed convictions. She specifically targeted young men of color, knowing public defenders were too overworked to mount a proper defense, and knowing the juries in her selected districts would lean into their implicit biases. DeAndre Hayes was just supposed to be another number on her spreadsheet. The gallery murmured in absolute disgust. Gregory Thomas, the brave law clerk who had worn the wire, also took the stand. He detailed how Sterling would openly use racial slurs in her chambers, mocking the families of the defendants she had just condemned to decades in prison. He explained how the immense guilt of watching innocent people destroyed had finally pushed him to contact the DOJ. Against the advice of her high-priced defense attorney, Cynthia Sterling's colossal narcissism drove her to take the stand in her own defense. She believed, even now, that she could talk her way out of it. She wore a modest gray suit, attempting to project the image of a targeted, misunderstood public servant. "I made tough choices," Sterling told the jury, her voice trembling with rehearsed emotion. "I was trying to keep our community safe." "Mr. Pendleton is twisting innocent conversations out of context to pursue a political vendetta." Pendleton rose for cross-examination. He did not yell. He did not bluster. He approached the podium with the calm, terrifying precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. "Mrs. Sterling," Pendleton began, completely dropping her former title, "you claim your actions were about community safety. When William Caldwell paid you $100,000 3 days after you ordered evidence buried in the Hayes case, was that for community safety?" "That was a standard campaign contribution." Sterling snapped defensively. "To a secret offshore account in the Cayman Islands?" Pendleton shot back, sliding a bank manifest onto the projector screen. "A campaign account registered under your maiden name which you failed to disclose to the IRS?" Sterling's face paled. My accountant, handles those matters." "Your accountant is currently cooperating with the FBI, Mrs. Sterling, and he stated you directed the wire transfer personally," Pendleton said smoothly. He stepped closer. "You stated you wanted to keep the streets safe from people like DeAndre Hayes, a man with 0 criminal record, a man with an engineering degree, a man protecting his teenage sister. What exactly made him so dangerous to you, Mrs. Sterling? Was it his actions, or was it the color of his skin?" "Objection! Badgering!" her attorney shouted. "Overruled," Judge Montgomery said flatly, staring daggers at Sterling. "Answer the question." He broke a young man's arm," Sterling stammered, her polished facade finally cracking under the intense pressure. "He pushed a drunken assailant away from his sister." Pendleton thundered, his voice finally rising to fill the room. "And you knew that. You had the police report. You had the diner footage. You buried it all for a paycheck. You traded a young man's life for a down payment on a summer home, and you used the vilest prejudices of our society as your weapon." Sterling gripped the edges of the witness stand, her breathing ragged. She looked at the jury, searching for a single sympathetic face, but found only cold, hardened contempt. She looked at Judge Montgomery, who watched her with the disgust one reserves for a cockroach. For the first time in her life, Cynthia Sterling realized she had absolutely no power. She was completely, utterly trapped. "I have no further questions for this disgrace to the legal profession," Pendleton said, turning his back on her and returning to his seat. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When the foreperson stood to read the verdict, the words fell like hammer strikes. Guilty of racketeering. Guilty of conspiracy to commit perjury. Guilty of wire fraud. Guilty of deprivation of rights under color of law. Guilty on all 34 counts. Sentencing day arrived beneath a bleak, overcast sky. The federal courthouse was surrounded by hundreds of protesters, but also by dozens of people holding signs bearing the names of family members wrongfully convicted by Cynthia Sterling. Inside, Judge Wallace Montgomery looked down from the bench at the woman standing before him in a drab, ill-fitting orange jumpsuit, her wrists chained to her waist. The heavy toll of incarceration had already aged her a decade. Her hair was entirely gray, her posture defeated. "Cynthia Sterling," Judge Montgomery began, his voice devoid of any mercy. "In my 40 years in the legal profession, I have rarely encountered a betrayal of public trust so profound, so calculated, and so uniquely malicious. You were entrusted with the sacred duty of upholding blind justice. Instead, you weaponized the bench. You operated a cash-for-convictions enterprise that targeted the most vulnerable members of our society. You are a predator who hid behind a gavel." Montgomery adjusted his glasses. "The systemic damage you have caused will take years to undo. The state is currently reviewing over 400 of your past convictions. You destroyed lives, fractured families, and poisoned the integrity of the judicial system. For these crimes, I am sentencing you to 280 months, 23 years in federal prison. And because of the nature of your civil rights violations, this sentence will be served without the possibility of early parole." Sterling collapsed to her knees, sobbing hysterically as the federal marshals hauled her to her feet and dragged her out of the courtroom. The karma that awaited her was severe and entirely poetic. Sterling was transported to a maximum security federal correctional institution in a different state. Stripped of all her wealth, her titles, and her privilege, she became simply inmate Hashite 4719 to 054. She was forced to live among the very demographics she had spent her life degrading and imprisoning. There were no special protections for corrupt judges in the general population. She spent her days scrubbing cafeteria floors, living in constant fear, entirely marginalized by a system she had once ruthlessly commanded. William Caldwell received 15 years in federal prison, his real estate empire seized and liquidated by the government to pay restitution to the victims of Sterling's court. Richard Belmont was disbarred and served 5 years. Meanwhile, a profound rebirth occurred from the ashes of the scandal. DeAndre Hayes filed a massive federal civil rights lawsuit against the county and the police department for false arrest, malicious prosecution, and systemic civil rights violations. Faced with overwhelming, undeniable evidence, the city settled out of court for a staggering $25 million. But DeAndre did not take the money and disappear to a private island. He used his mechanical engineering degree and his newfound capital to found Hayes Innovative Solutions, a green energy tech firm that specifically recruited talented graduates from underprivileged neighborhoods. He bought his mother a beautiful home in a safe, quiet suburb and paid for his sister Chloe's entire medical school tuition. Furthermore, DeAndre took $5 million of his settlement and partnered with Lisa Carmichael, the exhausted public defender who had fought for him when no one else would. Together, they established the Carmichael Hayes Foundation for Equal Justice, a heavily funded legal aid clinic dedicated to providing elite, high-powered defense attorneys for low-income and minority youth facing an unbalanced judicial system. 5 years after that terrifying day in courtroom 302, DeAndre stood on the steps of his foundation's brand-new downtown headquarters. Arthur Pendleton and Gregory Thomas were in attendance, smiling warmly. DeAndre cut the ceremonial red ribbon as flashbulbs popped, not to capture a criminal, but to capture a hero. The system had tried to bury him in the dark. Instead, they had planted a seed. and from it grew a towering oak of justice that would shield thousands from the very tyranny he had survived. Did this dramatic tale of justice and ultimate karma keep you on the edge of your seat? The truth always comes to light, no matter how deeply it is buried. If you enjoyed this intense courtroom story, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, real-life inspired stories of justice served. Leave a comment below with your thoughts.